Overview. Sam Quinones's The Least of Us, 2021, is an in-depth analysis of drug use and addiction in America and how it has been exacerbated by Mexican smugglers, drug traffickers, and pharmaceutical companies. Quinones chronicles the American opioid epidemic and explores the far-reaching damage generated by the meth and fentanyl crises. This follow-up to his bestseller Dreamland is a powerful combination of scientific research and new insights into the reality of drug use. From real-life experiences of drug victims and addicts, Quinones tells stories of pain, weakness, and wreckage. He also reveals how food chains and international corporations indirectly use the language of drugs to target consumers and satisfy their cravings. Opioid Era. The human species has had experiences with the opium poppy for 5,000 years. It contains the best and most addictive painkiller that humans know. America's opioid era started in the mid-1990s, and it has been characterized by a desperate search for comfort and convenience, as well as destruction and isolation both in rich and poor regions. The crisis of opioid pain relievers has been spreading and intensifying across the nation. By August 2005, Ryan Rapazski had been working at the Drug Enforcement Administration in Chicago for more than a year. He was handling a case of cocaine trafficking out of Sinaloa, Mexico, the place where Mexican drug trafficking started. Sinaloa also contains some of the world's most dangerous drug cartels. Traffickers from Sinaloa had always marketed their drugs in Chicago. Then they would send their products to nearby areas, in addition to Detroit, Indianapolis, and Milwaukee. Cocaine had been the most common drug in Chicago for several years. Traffickers from Sinaloa would sell it to gangsters who would sell it back on the streets. The Sinaloans realized that Americans were getting addicted to opioids, including pain pills and heroin, so they started delivering more heroin to the streets of Chicago after favoring cocaine and marijuana for years. In 1999, Eduardo Chavez, a young man from New Mexico, applied for the DEA in the hope that he would see and experience big things. Chavez thus experienced an unprecedented shift in drug trafficking. The first traffickers in Mexico were farmers from the ranchos. In their villages, the weak had no chance of surviving, and people knew that their lives depended on the land. They were traditional and conservative, but they stopped growing beans and corn to grow marijuana and opium poppy. Studying opiates. Dr. Paul Janssen was a Belgian chemist and one of the prominent scientists of the 20th century. He was one of the first scientists to dedicate himself wholly to chemistry and pharmacology, searching for new medicines and drugs. He had a massive capacity for work. By the time he died in 2003, he had become the leading drug inventor in the world. The World Health Organization's model list of essential medicines included 18 of his innovations. He created haloperidol, more commonly known as Haldol, which reduces schizophrenic hallucinations. The drug ended the age of the insane asylum as more institutionalized patients were released. Janssen became obsessed with discovering new painkillers, which pushed him to try understanding opiates, especially morphine, and in 1960 he synthesized fentanyl. Gary Henderson, a professor of pharmacology at the University of California, Davis, developed a fentanyl detector test, so Janssen invited him to Belgium for a visit. During the 1970s, Henderson visited Janssen Pharmaceutica 3 times. Janssen discussed a deal to distribute fentanyl in China. According to him, Chinese authorities needed to establish a joint venture by which they would be able to learn how to fabricate the drug. By the end of the 1970s, the fentanyl test that Henderson had created was widely used. He continued researching and developing other drugs. Whenever a pharmaceutical company comes up with a new drug, it puts a lot of money and time into researching the drug and determining how the public will use it, especially when it's a powder. Chemists conduct tests of mixing and combining with other powders. They use a sample from the mixture and dissolve it in water. Then they follow a process to identify the amounts of each ingredient in the mix. These tests aim to determine how long the powders must be mixed with the new drug in order to result in a blend uniformity validation, which means that the drug is equally present in all parts of the mixture. That is the fundamental step to reach content uniformity, which means there is 95% certainty that every pill the company sends to the market contains the exact same amount of the drug. What happened with the street drugs sold all over America was a failure of this kind of content uniformity. Real-life horror. Across the country, there were stories everywhere that reflected the real-life horrors of the drug crisis. In 2008, Dr. Michael Rhodes, a physician in Springfield, Tennessee, was known for prescribing narcotic painkillers. He was the main source of pills that ultimately circulated on the streets. One woman claimed at a conference that her son overdosed on pills that Rhodes had prescribed. Purdue Pharma sales representatives issued reports about Rhodes. The pharmaceutical company even conducted an investigation and discovered that he was feeding addicts. An addict he had previously advised to take 90 OxyContin died of an overdose later on. Prosecutors even filed lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies in an attempt to collect the expenses of addiction cases. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor and paid a fine of $634 million. One day in July 2012, a pregnant woman was brought into Pensacola's Sacred Heart Hospital. She was a prostitute and a drug addict who had been left without oxygen for hours following an overdose. She was now paralyzed, blind, and unable to hear or speak. Her name was Starla, and she was the most serious case that Dr. Jim Thorpe had seen, even though he had worked with drug-addicted pregnant women before. In January 2013, Starla delivered a premature girl by C-section. The baby's umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck, and she was heavily affected by the drugs that her mother was given by the hospital staff. The emergence of Narcan. In 2014, there was a rapid rise in fentanyl use. The epidemic of opioid use persisted through prescription painkillers, and by 2013, numerous users of pain pills had become addicted and were starting to use heroin. Fentanyl proved very profitable, and the growing market was tempting. By 2015, a new drug emerged and formed the third stage of the epidemic. It was unknown to everyone except for anesthesiologists and surgeons. Groups of 20 and 50 overdoses were registered across the country after people began using heroin crudely mixed with fentanyl. But there was an antidote, naloxone, more commonly known as Narcan. It interrupts heroin, oxycodone, and fentanyl overdoses by instantly reviving the person overdosing. Nevertheless, the massive doses given to homeless people overdosing on the street usually cause withdrawal, the symptoms of which include shaking, anxiety, and shivering. Nowadays, naloxone is widely perceived to be the savior of heroin and fentanyl addicts. Earlier, though, it was only known to paramedics and scientists. Heroin and fentanyl. By the end of the 1960s, some U.S. soldiers started returning home from Vietnam as heroin addicts, but the majority of them managed to get rid of their addictions back home. At home, drugs were not as accessible as in a war zone. The 1970s heroin had to cross continents and oceans, then pass through New York before it reached addicts. Still, it was nothing like the quality they had grown used to in Southeast Asia. However, by the end of the 1990s, the situation changed. The supply of pain pills was huge, and they were spreading everywhere because doctors were prescribing them more. Then the supply of heroin skyrocketed as its prices decreased. By the start of 2014, as Akron, Ohio was recovering from an industrial blow, deaths resulting from heroin overdoses were increasing rapidly. The city had last witnessed a surge in heroin addiction during the 1970s. Akron was typical of many towns left with nothing but deserted factories and the feeling that something fundamental was destroyed. Heroin had good timing and happened to feel right at home. Yet, several decades later, the same drug accompanied the start of better times for some reason. Some people believed that the epidemic of opioid addiction was receiving attention only because its victims were mostly white and middle class, which was true. The problem also remained hidden for years because the victims' families, overwhelmed with shame, tried to cover up the real reason behind the death of their loved ones. In 2014, a total of 2,531 Ohioans overdosed on drugs, and 156 of them died in Summit County in Akron. Additionally, fentanyl was replacing heroin as the most fatal opioid in Ohio, whereas other states had not come to know fentanyl yet. Around 500 Ohioans overdosed on fentanyl the same year, and in 2015, the number increased by more than double. It reached 1,155, and in 2017, that same number tripled again. Meanwhile, police continued handling drug overdoses with indifference. Neuroscience. There is a blue spot behind every ear and right above the stem of the human brain that plays a major role in our survival. It is the locus ceruleus, which scientists call the LC. The LC evolves early in humans. Its main task is to send the noradrenaline chemical to different areas of the brain that, in turn, send warnings of threats. Noradrenaline plays the role of an alarm by pressing the panic button. Without noradrenaline, human beings would have perished a long time ago. Opiates alter many things in the brain, which includes suppressing and shutting down the LC. With opiates, the LC is unable to send the chemical that generates pain. As a consequence, the LC, which is the result of a history of evolution, is almost muted. In the meantime, the opiate causes the body to overdose. The opiate also convinces the LC that life without it would become dangerous and impossible. Studies conducted on addict brains prove that when the brain enters withdrawal, the LC becomes agitated and sends out a massive amount of noradrenaline particles, which in turn generate panic, insomnia, and anxiety. These effects lead to a chemical scream that the body must get drugs or it will die. Dopamine also leads the human brain into activities that generate good feelings. It reaches a node in the pleasure circuit inside the human brain called the nucleus accumbens, where it gives a feeling of motivation. Neuroscientists call these maps a reward pathway. It promotes our fundamental impulses and instincts. Most importantly, it brings back feelings of pleasure from basic activities necessary for our survival. These chemical particles that deliver messages from one area of the human brain to another are called neurotransmitters. Noradrenaline and dopamine are two of them. Neurotransmitters transmit messages by sticking to receptors, which generates feelings of desire, pleasure, pain, etc. However, despite the importance of neurotransmitters, the human brain only produces limited quantities of them. Eating, exercising, connecting with others, all these activities help us survive, and our brains have evolved so that we feel pleasure whenever we engage in them. Our brain has also evolved to make us require physical touches from others. We need hugs, kisses, and pats in order to strengthen those feelings and activities that help us stay alive. By natural coincidence, some plants happen to create chemicals that, once they enter the human body, activate the same receptors. Probably the most famous of these plants are marijuana and the opium poppy. The damages incurred. The first major case of fentanyl in Manchester, New Hampshire happened in 2015. A woman named Jeanette Hardy was receiving 5 kilos of fentanyl weekly from Massachusetts. The quantity she had in her possession made her the leading dealer in the region. She lived alone but did not know how to hide the drugs, so someone tried stealing them and killed her in the process. As in Hardy's case, massive supplies of fentanyl made the drug trade available to everyone, leading it to cause great damage across the nation. By 2015, fentanyl supplies were arriving from Chinese companies that sold it on the web and from Mexican traffickers. Fentanyl has caused much change to drug use in America by also affecting the African American community. When mixtures of fentanyl and cocaine started hitting the streets, black people suddenly began overdosing along with the white middle class. Organic chemistry can in fact be modified in countless ways. The molecules, like Lego, can be used and reshaped to build nearly anything. Opioid addiction requires complete obedience from the addict. This is proved by the things that addicts are willing to do in order to get these drugs. Newport Beach. In 2014, neuroscientists acknowledged the fact that a drug's potential to cause addiction was largely related to the quantity taken, how often it is taken, and the time it takes to reach the bloodstream. In 2018, the Los Angeles Times wrote that the homeless population in LA increased by 75% in only 6 years. This made sense because during those years, the Mexican supply of a new, weird type of meth also surged. With no law enforcement surveillance and an endless supply of chemical precursors arriving through Pacific Coast ports, the production of Mexican meth increased exponentially. Starting from 2013 and lasting for several years, the labs simply exceeded all limits. Newport Beach in California was a sin city run by mobs throughout most of the 20th century. Illicit gambling, strip clubs, and prostitution marked life and trade. For several years, mobs managed to keep Newport devoid of drugs because it was awful for business. However, as the gambling mob slowly faded away, drugs started creeping in. P2P. A mother in her 30s named Kirsten started using methamphetamine in Vancouver, Washington, when she was just 14. She used it for many years and tried going sober several times. In 2013, she realized that the meth she'd been using for some time was somehow different. It no longer made her crave companionship and have easy conversations. Instead, it became difficult for her to talk. She started hearing voices and eating very poorly. Her once pretty teeth turned black. By 2016, she was having visions of demons and angels, hallucinating and unable to focus or recall basic things. Everyone believed she was schizophrenic. However, those were the effects of the P2P meth. Across all America, people like Kirsten were developing the same symptoms due to the same drug. It was damaging addicts' brains very quickly. The symptoms included hallucinations, rotted teeth, paranoia, intense memory loss, uncontrollable movements, and in most cases, homelessness. People suffering from these symptoms were unresponsive to the usual methods of rehabilitation. Ephedrine meth is bad for the brain, but it does not cause this damage. This new meth proved much deadlier than ephedrine meth. It was causing heart failure for young people, whereas this disease is common only among people over 65. A vicious addiction. Nowadays, drug dealers act like international companies, and international companies act like drug dealers. They both clearly understand the way the human brain works, exactly like neuroscientists. Wendy's, for example, is one of the leading hamburger chains in the U.S. Its menu is designed to make people crave it, and its ads give the promise of pure pleasure. Marijuana dealers have used the same technique for quite some time. This shows that whenever we go to Wendy's, McDonald's, or Taco Bell, we often speak the language of addiction. ISO. Despite its beauty and wealth, Los Angeles remains the homeless capital of the United States. Most of the homelessness issue is now rooted in the massive supplies of meth coming from Mexican dealers. In Los Angeles, transgender women, in particular, are very vulnerable. They cross the country to look for drugs, fame, therapy, and most importantly, surgery. They arrive without a friend or family member and become addicted to meth, which slowly makes them easier to control. By 2018, P2P meth was spreading across America. An uncontrollable free market produces massive quantities of the drug and manages to find unthinkable ways to get it through the borders. Meth has arrived in every corner of America, reminding us how prescription pills filled the nation decades earlier. In fact, OxyContin did relieve many Americans from pain, and it's unacceptable that one of the most common consequences of the opioid crisis is that specialists cut people off from painkillers they'd been taking without any issue for years. In August 2018, a new drug was found after it killed someone by overdose near Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The drug was known as Isotonitazine. It is an opioid that was initially produced in the 1950s, and it targets the same brain receptors as fentanyl. ISO, as it's now called on the streets, was then discovered in several bodies in Chicago and Milwaukee before spreading to Michigan, Indiana, and Tennessee, killing at least 230 people. Some researchers claim this new drug is marketed by Chinese labs in order to replace fentanyl, which was banned in 2019 by Chinese authorities. The importance of drug demand in all of this cannot be overstated. However, it must be emphasized that all drug stories start with supply. The epidemic of opioid addiction began with a massive quantity of painkillers administered each year, resulting in widespread addiction that has persisted to this day. Author's style. The Least of Us is a well-written follow-up centered around scientific findings and based on rigorous research. It is packed with enthralling narratives and divided into 3 main parts. However, chapters often get disconnected as Quinones swiftly changes from one topic to another, which repeatedly interrupts the flow of ideas. Author's perspective. Sam Quinones is an American writer and longtime journalist. He is most famous for chronicling the opioid crisis in America in his 2015 book Dreamland, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for general nonfiction. We hope you've enjoyed the insights on Sam Quinones' The Least of Us. Purchase the book to learn more.